and we'll spend some time on the top six. We'll start with yours, and I was happy that we had different top sixes. Gives us something to argue about a little bit, or discuss politely, whatever you want to call it. We'll start with your top six. Let's get the graphic up here, Aaron, from Harm's top six. You're going with Anthony Beauvillier, Elias Pettersson, and Andrei Kuzmenko on the top line. Your second line, Ilya Mikheyev, JT Miller, and Brock Besser. So let's start with the top line there. We've spent a lot of time on Pettersson. Let's talk about his wingers in your ideal top six. Anthony Beauvillier is the one that surprised me a little bit. Not a ton. Yeah. I get some people are putting him there, but he's the name that I don't think Kuzmenko's a lock beside Pettersson. Yeah. I feel like Beauvillier, that spot's kind of open. Why did you choose to put him there on Pettersson's line?
It's because I trust Pettersson and Kuzmenko enough to drive that line, and I think Mikheyev offers more value in lifting the second line than Beauvillier would. It's more about spreading the talent for me rather than completely loading up one line. And the reason I say that is because I think that second line, Miller, Besser, Mikheyev, you're probably, based off what we saw from Tocchet and even Boudreau beforehand, Miller's probably going to go up against the other team's best lines. Even if it's not in a hard match role, he's going to get a lot of, opening night, he's going to get a lot of McDavid and Draisaitl. And if he's doing that, he needs more speed on his wings. You look back at why the Canucks had a disastrous start last season, and Miller was on for all the first 8 goals against. It wasn't just Miller. It was the fact that, he had no help on his wings from a defensive perspective. Brock Besser, who's typically pretty reliable and who I expect to bounce back from a two-way perspective, had by far his worst defensive season of his career, right? Struggled with turnovers and all sorts of things. So Miller didn't have that help. And Tanner Pearson had just lost a step, right? He was too slow. And that line as a whole, foot speed-wise, Besser is not fleet of foot. You need more speed on that line, in my opinion. And that's where Mikheyev, and of course, a lot of this hinges on, how healthy does he look in camp coming back from his ACL surgery?
Big time, yeah.
Hopefully he still has that pop and explosiveness in his stride. That's a big assumption. But if he does, then he's going to add that speed on the forecheck and providing a lot of the dirty work, in my opinion, that line needs, especially in consideration of his defensive chops and how disruptive he is, how many battles he wins. Again, you want to talk about who's going to match McDavid's speed. I would like the idea of entrusting Mikheyev in this type of checking role.
Yeah, I can see where you're coming from. That it makes a lot of sense. I guess the only thing I look at is with Beauvillier playing with Pettersson, you still want your best offensive player to be in the best offensive position. And you bring up a very good point with balancing out the top six, and I agree with you that Mikheyev does help do that. I don't think Beauvillier is I think Beauvillier is a little bit more of a trusted defensive mind. He can play, he's a solid defensively. He's not going to blow you away. He's not Mikheyev's level, that's for sure. I don't think I had Beauvillier in my top six, and that was kind of the interesting thing when I saw yours, and I kind of knew where you were going to go with this. I had a feeling you were going to talk about balancing out that second line and bringing some defense there, and that's true. I just felt like in mine, I loaded up the top six a little more. We'll get mine up here now too. I loaded up the top line a little bit more with more offense. I did Kuzmenko at left wing, Pettersson there in the middle, and then Mikheyev on the right wing. And that's where I struggled because I was like, I don't know if I love Beauvillier on the second line. I could see him being on the third line. And now with P.S. Suter coming in, I like that even more now. I like Beauvillier and Suter on a third line with Connor Garland. That feels like a third line that should beat a lot of other teams' third line. So I went with Podkolzin sliding into the top six. And I know that's a difficult spot, but I think that after the season that he just had, kind of understanding the person he is, the player he is, the work ethic that this guy carries, I think he's coming back this year hard. He has to in his own right. And it's certainly possible that he flops because think about last year going into the season. Not only were we talking about Podkolzin being the guy who steps up and really kind of takes over and takes that big step, NHL.com articles were talking about players who are going to have a breakout season. And I remember Vasily Podkolzin was the title photo that they used for that article. He was primed to have a big step up last year, and it just didn't happen. He had to spend a decent amount of time in the AHL. But I like him on Miller's wing. And I like him with Brock Besser kind of as well because you're looking at that defensive help. And I guess I'm banking on Podkolzin in my situation. You probably feel a little bit more confident about yourself because you're banking on Mikheyev. I would rather bank on Mikheyev's defensive play than Vasily Podkolzin's, but I don't feel horrible about having him on the second line because I do think that puts him in a position to be a top six forward. And if Podkolzin or Niels Höglander, you could use his name as well. If one of those two players is a top six forward for you, really helps the third line and it really helps the winger depth on this team. So that's why I put Podkolzin into my top six.
I like the idea of sort of Beauvillier and Suter, and now you've got a great third line. I disagree with Podkolzin in top 6 role unless he takes a massive step.
Right.
And I expect him obviously to be better than he was last season. But you're penciling in a guy that had 7 points last season. 7 NHL points in
you
your
got
top
me there,
6.
Harm. I'll give you that one.
I just can't. I can't get over that, right?
Yeah.
And not to mention, you're throwing him almost to the wolves, right? Because again, that line's going to play toughs, and he has the potential to become a good defensive player. He's not there yet. He's still inconsistent. The work rate is always there, but he is not. He's just not quite there yet. I mean, look at, and the coaching staff doesn't have the trust in him yet, which I think they should have had more trust in him down the stretch, especially. But even in the second half, when the games didn't matter, he was playing 7, 8, 9 minutes a night. Do you think Rick Tocchet, day one, opening night, JT Miller, you're going up against Connor McDavid, do you think he's tapping Vasily Podkolzin on the shoulder? I think it's a lot to ask for. Again, I'm not saying that Podkolzin is incapable of a breakup because we're seeing the amount of work he's putting in.
Yep,
Such a good kid.
Stayed in Vancouver again this summer.
I expect him to take a step this year, but penciling him in top 6 right away. He had 7 points last year, man.
Didn't have a child last year, though, Harm. He's got the dad strength now. I have to make some sort of argument against him. You got me good with that 7 points thing. I'll give you that. There's some other comments in here as well. I asked people to mention their top 6. Vince says Podkolzin, Pettersson, Kuzmenko as his top line. Mikheyev, Miller, and Garland as the second line. I can see that happening too. That doesn't have Brock Besser in the top 6. And what does that mean for a third line if Brock Besser's in that spot? Because I do think that there is as much as Connor Garland's game seems to not really fit with anyone, the guy that it fits with the best is JT Miller, I think, when they do play together.
Yeah.
Like, I think that's where Garland can be a little bit. But then in my eyes, that's why this line makes a lot of sense for me, because Mikheyev's on that line to help them out as well defensively and kind of be in the right position at all times. But in my lines, you're right. Putting Podkolzin on a line with JT Miller and Brock Besser, whose defense can be questioned at times for sure. I know we've talked about Brock Besser making a lot of improvements in that realm, but he's still not like dominant defensively. Like, he's not at that level. He probably will never be at that level. But I think it's interesting to think about it with Brock Besser out of the top 6, because it's real possible. You don't think so?
Brock Besser's at his best when he is not the best player on his line. Look at him. He's a complimentary guy. He's like, he reminds me a lot of almost Toffoli, right? Where he doesn't have the speed, right? He's not going to make dynamic plays on his own, but he's a guy that's smarter on the net and can get open and can complement elite skill, right? You look at when he's played his best, it was Lotto line, even in the shortened 56 game season when it was away from Pettersson, he still played a lot with JT Miller. And you look back at last season whenever he was playing third line and he was stuck with like Sheldon Dries, and the hope there is, okay, Brock Besser, you're a true top 6 talent on the third line. Let's hope you can drive this line. It never worked.
No, it didn't.
And it didn't. Whereas with Garland in the second half, we saw especially when he was sort of like the lone passenger sort of driving a third line, he was able to make it happen. He was able to produce 5-on-5 offense because he's more of a self-starter in terms of generating his own chances and being able to lug the puck, transport it, carry it, make plays, set guys up. He's more of an independent contractor, whereas Besser, I think, is more reliant on talent like a JT Miller to get him the puck and be at his best.
Get to some comments here. Tim Jones says Pod and Abby for me. Pod's on the second line is a deal breaker for me, is what Tim says. And Tim says I can actually see Hug winding up in a middle 6 role. So I had this. I was on Sportsnet 650 last couple days hosting with Josh Elliott Wolf, and his top 6 had Phil DiGiuseppe in it, and I thought that was wild. But it kind of brought up another conversation that I wanted to at least throw your way. Out of these, let's just go with 2 players in Vasily Podkolzin and Nils Höglander. Who's more likely to be on the outside looking in on opening night? Because is Podkolzin, I think the worry would be, can Höglander play 4th line for Rick Tocchet? Can he fit in that role? I think Podkolzin probably can a little bit more. But is there a view right now of Höglander, of him even being a legitimate possibility in the top 9 role when you have Podkolzin that I think is above on a lot of people's depth charts than Nils Höglander? And don't get me wrong, I watched him a ton in the AHL. I loved what Höglander did developing last year. I also don't think it fixed everything. That AHL run didn't cure his defensive worries. It probably helped them a little bit, but it didn't cure everything. So I'm going into next season, and in my eyes, I have Podkolzin being more of an option in the top 9 than Höglander. But I've seen this comment, and Tim's one that I'm bringing up here from the YouTube chat. I've seen this comment a little bit more and more. People saying Podkolzin's not even going to be in the opening night lineup. And it sounds crazy to me, but do you give any thought to, out of those two players, which one's more likely to be on the outside?
It's a good question. It's going to be obviously determined in camp. That's a smart ass answer. But right now, if I were sort of viewing it, I would say Höglander probably has a tougher road because, again, for starters, Podkolzin's physicality and size makes him a better fit, probably in more of a grinding fourth line type role alongside a Dakota Joshua. Höglander also probably has more defensive concerns in terms of his puck management, turnovers, and in-zone defensive play. Mm-hmm. And the other part that I was considering when they signed Suter was, okay, let's say you hypothetically have Suter and Garland as your two fixtures on a third line right now. Would Tocchet feel comfortable with Höglander as a third piece on that? Because Garland is undersized, Suter is slightly undersized, and then Höglander would be undersized.
Yeah.
I don't think he'd want to play 3 small guys on a line together.
Yeah. I mean, unless you're just trying to like barrage a team with offense and a third line role.
Rick Tocchet doesn't seem like that type of guy, right? He's like, I want. Don't you think he would be like, oh, I need some meat and potatoes. Give me Phil DiGiuseppe.
Yeah,
over there.
By the way, and I say this as much as I can. Phil DiGiuseppe is not 5'10". Like he's 6'2". He's a
big body,
size guy. I think because
doesn't he seem like a Rick Tocchet guy?
He does totally. But I think people look at PDG and they think of him as a quad A player. And I think when you think quad A player, you immediately think like 5'10" scorer. And that's not what Phil DiGiuseppe is. He to me, he's a fourth line NHL.
I think he's a good fourth liner.
Yeah, and you're right. He is the type of player who's going to run through a wall for a coach, especially if that coach believes in him. And Rick Tocchet absolutely believes in Phil DiGiuseppe. I just find it with so much more offensive talent on the wings. I actually see Phil DiGiuseppe potentially being the odd man out of that group. Like I see him not even being on a fourth line. I can see him being the 13th.
Oh yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense.
And now with the PS Suter signing, like Neil Zaman is now an extra player. He's probably your 13th forward because he can play center. You can probably throw him on the wing if you really want to or whatever. So like the second center who's kind of their 14th guy now, like it could be Phil DiGiuseppe, it could be Niels Höglander. It's just it's very hard, I think, now to create your lineup and have both Podkolzin and Höglander in it. Like it's pretty hard to do.
Well, we also got to remember we're in August.
Totally.
I remember last year we came up with all these line combinations. This is how the top 9 is going to work. And oh my God, look at this depth. Like the season hasn't even started and Besser McKay are hurt.
Right.
Like that's the other thing to keep in mind is right now you can look at it and be like, oh, so many guys on the outside looking in. How is this going to work? How are guys going to get an opportunity? And it's like, you may not even have to wait till opening night for a lot of those answers to unfortunately become obvious.
Yeah, they'll play out the situation for us in the first place.